Hey folks, my Metroidvania binge continues, since I'll be tackling Metamorphosis games Gestalt, Steam, and Cinder, which takes a narrative-heavy approach to the genre. But that begs the question, doesn't it? Was Gestalt a whole lot of hot air, or was it more than the sum of its parts? I'm your host Darlian, let's find out together. To say that the world of Gestalt is troubled is to put it lightly. First, the calamity leveled the surface, leaving it in a post-apocalyptic state. That said, it was then followed closely by the opening of the Abyss, a nigh literal gate to hell. Oblivion seemed all but assured until humanity built a bunch of friggin' Sentai fueled by the Abyss to fight back, which definitely had no repercussions at all. Surely, these abyssal knights didn't become corrupted by their power, kicking off a rebellion which tore the remnants of society apart, and then, in turn, caused a generations-long civil war. That's unfathomable! That could never happen! So yeah, the world of Gestalt is in pretty rough shape, to the point that it's honestly surprising they've reached steampunk levels of technology. Not that it's doing much good, given that a third apocalyptic event is potentially due, and an attempt at a truce fails right out the gate. Terrible stuff, really. Which makes it a relief that the focus of this story is Alethea, a Soldner, mercenary, who's just trying to get by. Or she would be, were it not for the fact that she finds herself in the wrong place at the right time, and thus becomes embroiled in a conspiracy that will determine the fate of the city, and possibly even the world, while revealing her own forgotten path. So yeah, all in all, it's a fairly neat premise, and one that the game puts a lot of work into telling. Only, the way that it's executed frequently comes at the expense of the gameplay. Let me explain myself here. In and of itself, the cutscenes do a decent job of laying out the overall premise of the game, but they're extremely intrusive, often queuing up as you're progressing through an area. And I do mean often, since if you're moving at a relatively steady clip, or, not obsessively exploring and grinding, it's entirely possible for the game to wrench you out of playing every 15 to 20 minutes. And this can just chain together given the sheer number of scenes lodged in Gestalt. Which then brings me to the next point, because as jarring as that is, what finally broke any semblance of immersion for me was how more than half of Gestalt's story drags the focus away from the protagonist and settles it squarely on the Machiavellian plots that are currently happening behind the scenes. Most of which, I should mention, boils down to a combination of exposition that's lightly being talked around, and foreshadowing for some fairly belated payoffs. Ultimately, I came away feeling that the story is less a matter of organically discovering the events at hand, and more sitting through the synopsis of a plot. A sometimes repetitive synopsis, given the dialogue will echo itself as though it has little faith in the player's ability to follow along. But honestly, despite everything, I do have to give it credit. At the end of the day, Gestalt had managed to build up some fairly central questions which I was legitimately looking forward to seeing answered, to where it was going, and then the game ended. Yeah, it is hard for me to describe how abrupt the conclusion feels, but if I have to, shameless sequel baiting. That feels like the most accurate description. I felt robbed, both by the ending itself and the sheer lack of closure or answers. It's just more ominous foreshadowing and the promise that the player will eventually get answers if only they'd poke at a sequel or DLC. Yeah, it's sort of a grim note to finish the story segment on, but here we are. So, let's shift gears and talk shop about Steam and Cinder's gameplay, which, given its nature as a Metroidvania, means it's time to tackle its exploration elements. And the awkwardness I ran into here. Now, I do want to be clear, I am rather fond of Gestalt's stage design, as venturing through the regions felt nice enough the first time around, and I couldn't help but appreciate the manner in which they each harbor their own distinct obstacles and enemies. And I will never complain when a game takes steps to enable efficient shortcuts for a diligent player. That said, for a title that exists within the genre, the experience felt fairly linear. When I explored a region, I generally found myself guided through the bulk of its content to the point that it began to cultivate a sense of almost being on the rails. While this does mean you'll get to see the gist of the puzzles and obstacles that will define each of the regions, and in fact, would be hard-pressed to bypass what it has in store for you, this ultimately makes the game feel closer to an action platformer rather than the exploration-focused endeavor I was hoping for. That's not to say side paths didn't exist, but the majority of them felt quite shallow to the point that there were only a handful of times where I found myself rewarded with anything more than a new shortcut or a small nook with a chest or collectible after I'd backtracked to a location with the double jump or air dash. And even when it did provide something, it'd be extremely limited in scope, to the point that I only really encountered a handful of solid optional bits by the time had run its course, and the crux of those were near the finale. So yeah, again, I was super grateful that the shortcuts were as robust as they were, because between that and early access to a fast travel system, it meant that backtracking to these smaller segments was less painful than it might have otherwise been, given the payoff. But okay, I've said my bit on navigating its world. What I haven't addressed is the combat and character building, and this is where Gestalt had a bit more to offer on a mechanical level. Take the basics of combat. While you're initially limited to a brief sword combo, a one-shot pistol, and a pair of stamina-limited evasive options, it wastes very little time before introducing the stagger meter and a secondary pistol shot which eschews direct damage in favor of chunking it. Given that a staggered enemy is disabled for a decent amount of time, loses any existing defenses they may have, and takes extra damage, this small change already provides players with more choices, such as whether they should focus on disabling an armored enemy to finish it off, or to pick off potentially squishier enemies while it's disabled, or even just use the gun's normal shot to just vaporize something small to facilitate maneuvering around. And Gestalt's ammo system adds another strategic layer to the equation, since the bulk of your energy is generated by hitting enemies who aren't staggered, forcing you into the fray in order to make use of the mechanic. Something I should note that worked incredibly well during the boss fights, since their health and defense ensured fights will drag on by default, forcing a player to find gaps in their attack patterns to generate the energy needed to stagger and melt them. And that feeling was further reinforced when I unlocked the crunchy heavy attack, which provides a short-range option to spend ammo on. But even with that, it didn't actually take all that long for Gestalt's combat to feel as though it plateaued for me. The biggest factors simply boil down to how its fights pan out, because sure, there may be a decent array of enemies to fight, but a lot of those normal enemy encounters boil down to them spamming one or two attacks, generally leaving only enough time to roll through, take a slice, and back off. And I do mean needing to back off because enemies do not have any form of hit stun, disincentivizing attempts at trying to do more elaborate combo chains if you don't want to trade hits. And speaking of trading hits, I should mention, yeah, your healing is sort of relegated to the whole Estus Flask type thing. So, no small wonder then that I began to cheese the encounters as best as I could, such as sitting on a platform below an enemy and tickling their feet with standing or jumping slices until they died, or smacking one through a wall. Still, what's weird about all of this is that it runs afoul of another of Gestalt's systems, specifically Alethia's leveling tree. While the majority of it is composed of stat nodes that boost her health or damage, there's also a number of skill nodes ranging from a passive extension to her combo chain or ammo capacity to more active options like new heavier light attacks, which sounds like it would be neat, but well, I never found a point where attacking out of a backstep was more efficient than rolling behind an enemy. It certainly didn't leave me as vulnerable, and this is only compounded in the case of the alternate heavy attacks because while they're pretty, they also tend to be situational to the point that I never really found myself leaning on any of them organically. Their case also wasn't helped by the skill nodes, which further ramped the power and utility of the safer gun options. If you cap out the skill tree, they are powerful to an unhinged degree, and well, Gestalt makes it easy since even after maxing out the tree and emptying the skill point shop, I had leftovers. But then it is kind enough to grant them for leveling, completing quests, and for certain collectibles. Not that this enables you to break the game early on, since Alethia's leveling tree is gated with portions of it only unlocking when she's acquired the relevant progression ability. Also, this weird bit of generosity isn't just limited to your skill points, since it provides you a few backup materials to improve your healing item, and by a few I mean, there came a point where I was hoping to see something else would pop out of a chest. Seriously, even with the potion upgrades costing more with each new improvement, I had enough to boost it again and still have change left over. Which is sort of busted, because the boost to healing efficiency you unlock in the skill tree are additive, making each one practically a full heal by the end of the game. So, no, what I was hoping for was more accessories, because, well, accessories are perhaps the only real difference most players will see in their characters' endgame builds, being a set of up to 4 items you can equip to our stalwart Soldner. And they are certainly useful, being able to reduce damage you take by 1%, or boosting your damage, or... Yeah, no, the vast majority of them really do boil down to being stat sticks that you slot in. That's not to say there aren't a couple of novel ones in there, like the one that makes using potions faster, but it's mostly a matter of crunchy numbers. Not everyone's cup of tea, but I enjoyed building a semi-efficient crit build. That's something, and it's not like you're disincentivized for messing around given there isn't a death penalty. Yet another merciful mechanic here, just like Gestalt choosing to eschew pits as a source of instant death. Hence why I finished the game with only 4 fatalities by the tail end. But yeah, that's the gameplay, so here we are, the aesthetics, the thing that caught my attention in the first place, because yeah, Gestalt is a great looking game from start to finish. Whether it's the enemy, the world, or the protagonist, everything looks great. I mean, yes, the maps themselves can be a little bit hazy at times, but frankly, this is offset by the fact that you can put down relatively precise markers for points of interest to explore later. Really, the only lingering flaw that stuck it in my mind by the game's end is the way that the dialogue portraits can sometimes clash with the scene that's playing out, because each character only has one. Still, what we're given instead is a world where the actual characters are animated during the scenes you're seeing, so I think it's a worthwhile trade, however distracting it may be. Oh, and audio-wise, the music does slap. It does such a great job of breathing a bit more life in the world, and builds very fitting ambience for something that embraces that steampunk theme. But it doesn't change my final thoughts on Steam and Cinder, and what those thoughts are is that Gestalt is ultimately in a bit of an odd place. It's a Metroidvania that doesn't really provide all that much on the exploration angle of things, an action platformer that can't help but constantly interrupt its own action with multiple cutscenes, and a narrative experience that kneecaps its finale while offering an empty mystery to mull over. That's not to say I particularly dislike any of these elements as a whole, but they're all a bit off the mark, working at odds with each other rather than synergistically, which is a shame because I came into this title wanting to like it more than I do. When I think about the 9.5 hours I spent fiddling through it, it's not exactly the sort of thing I'm excited to talk about. At the end of the day, I think Gestalt is inadequate experience. It's not something I'd find myself immediately recommending to someone in search of a Metroidvania though, or an action platformer, or even a narrative-oriented game, unless I couldn't think of anything else offhand, or they absolutely needed a post-apocalyptic steampunk aesthetic. It has that. So yeah, in my book, Gestalt, Steam and Cinder is a beautiful yet bizarrely fumbled experience. Also, it sort of pained me to realize that the bulk of Gestalt side quests are literally MMO tier filler goals, i.e. kill 5 or 10 of a given trash mob, or farm drops from a given biome. Woo! P.S. If anyone has considered commenting on how corgi accessories would push my crit past 100%, I know! But it also gives God mode, so no, I was not including it in my build. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description, and check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel like Greenwich Babby and Andy noted, and all those fine folks currently playing on the screen. You can get your name up there too if you back. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. There might be new designs by the end of next year. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.
Bye!